Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. And I look forward to interacting with you across the interfaces. Both Henrik and Saras have essentially said what I have to say. So we can probably jump directly into Q&A. I'm on the West Coast, Saras, and so it was that was part of the reason for the request. But the different reason for the request was to get you to speak first, I guess.
No problem.
I'm going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship from a performative point of view, and even as I was wondering what I should speak, and following Tough Taste advice, PowerPoint's corrupt. I was loath to put PowerPoints, but then that's the lingua franca apparently of presentations across Zoom. So I did create a PowerPoint, and so it was stitched together last minute, and it's got all kinds of vocabularies which are kind of a little bit different. So let me talk about that as I present my talk today. I don't want to go through all of this. It was just to talk about the pivots in the entrepreneurship literature itself. And this is just from some paper which I'd written before, but there are these micro and macro perspectives of agent-centric and context-centric. And then there was a period in time in which the debate between discovery and creation was rather vibrant. So this is in connection with the question which was asked before. And what I want to talk about is the performative approaches, which I will come at from narrative and stories and talk and conversations, which was what was there before, and what I want to call as neo-design. And I'll explain why I call it as neo-design as we keep on going further. But when we go from the left-hand side to the performative approaches, one of the big things, and I will talk about briefly later on, is you go from an individualistic ontology to a kind of embedded, embodied ontology, a kind of distributed and decentered ontology. And you go from things as they are, which is called as entative or substantive, to what is as process philosophy. So that's kind of a shift. And I want to spend more time on the performative approaches, which kind of, I think if you look at more recent pieces of work, including Henrik's piece in AMR on design, and Saras's work as she has been presenting it, they fall into these areas. So what is performativity? Why should we be concerned? I was initially attracted to the notion of performativity through John Austin's work of saying is doing. And the saying is doing is, it's a constituted world. And what that means is, in the very act of saying something, you're trying to do something. So the example is, I pronounce you man and wife, and so then you're married. So a new world begins, or I enact a new law. That saying is doing. So I think entrepreneurship, to be seen from that point of view, is rather interesting, that in the very saying of things, you're actually doing things. And there's a kind of a very robust literature, so I can't go into all these details. And if you, later on, I'll give you my own writings about these areas, so in case you want to pursue any of these. But this is something that Henrik actually quotes in his AMR piece. There's a Steve Jobs, where he collapses 3 industries in his presentation. And I don't have to read all of this, but he says every once in a while a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And Apple has been able to introduce a few of these. And then he talks about, a white screen iPod, a revolutionary mobile phone, a breakthrough internet communication device. And he keeps on repeating it. And he says, are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices, one device. So in his very speech, actually, he's showing you how the worlds around you, the boundaries or interfaces, all the discussions we had, the beautiful discussions are getting collapsed in the very saying of things. The other side of performativity, so one side is John Austin and the philosophical positions, Derrida, John Searle, where that comes from. The other side of it is in the doing of things. And it also connects with Herbert Simon's work clearly, of course, in the doing of things when he talks about oil paintings or Pittsburgh and on and on. But I'm kind of talking, I will just mention it from Karen Barad's work. And she says, doing is saying is the way I'm saying it at the moment. But she says the move towards performative alternatives to representationalism shifts the focus from questions of correspondence between descriptions and reality. Examples, do they mirror nature or culture, to matters of practices, doings, and actions. And if you want to come from science studies, because science has been evoked in these discussions prior to this, all you need to do is to go and look at Pickering's work. And Pickering talks about, the the oil chambers and other kinds of experiments that where things emerge in the doing of things. And there are many other positions in the middle, like Judith Butler, who is in the West Coast here as well. Beautiful work from feminist theory, or the discussions and debates between Michel Calon and other people around. So there are two positions of performativity. One is saying is doing, and the second is doing is saying. And the example of doing is saying is how Gmail came around. And this is Paul Buchet, who talks about the first version of Gmail was literally written in a day. It wasn't very impressive. All I did was take Google Groups, but it was live and people could use it. And then the main thing, and this is, he says, the point of this story is that you should consider spending less time talking and more time prototyping, especially if you're not good at talking or with PowerPoints. So here's the doing is saying that you create the prototypes, which I think Henrik would call as, either experimentation or transformation. I presume it's experimentation, I guess. But going from representationalism to performativity, there's a shift. And Henrik rightly titled the first session as meta-theoretical. And so it is, like Saras said, at a high level. But it is a shift from logico-scientific causal meaning to meaning making. And if you want to read something about this, Jerome Bruner is the best place to start. Two modes of thought. You go away from individual agency to decentered agency, or distributed decentered agency. And if you want to read more about it, active network theory, there's a whole corpus of literature. But if you want something very enjoyable, is Cognition in the Wild by Hutchings. That means, it is not the individual who's deciding, but the agencement, the arrangements, which is allowing that person to decide, and the agencies in that. And operating in context to contextualizing. So there's a sense of determinism, when you operate in context, that the context determines something. But the flip side of that is that entrepreneurs contextualize using the bits and pieces around them. And from substance thinking, in which there are, people with identities and objects with given functions, to process metaphysics, which is that everything is in a flow and that things are materialized. And if you want to pursue that, I would recommend reading Rescher's work on process metaphysics. And there's a lot of discussion and debate around that. And from prediction to prospection. So most people think about prediction, accuracy, and all that when it comes to entrepreneurship. But I think when it comes to performativity, the questions and issues shift about the worlds in the making, as Saras was talking about. So I want to talk about meaning making at the moment, and just talk about very briefly the narrative approach, which initially caught my attention a long time ago when John C.D. Brown came and made a presentation at NYU on stories and narratives and why that was important. And that got me into Jerome Bruner's work, Paul Ricoeur's work. This is just a statement out here: narratives traffic in human possibilities rather than settled certainties, and permit discourse to acquire a meaning without this meaning becoming pure information. So there's a kind of a shift from information to interpretation, which is a kind of a major shift in my opinion. And then this is coming from Simon's work, the next one, which is the doing part of it. Engineering, medicine, business, architecture, and painting are concerned not with the necessary, but with the contingent, not with how things are, but with how things might be, in short, with design. And so this is the sciences of the artificial, which Henrik was talking about earlier. So I want to talk about these two strands of literatures which or meta-theoretical strands, which have influenced my thinking in the last 10, 15 years now. And one of them is the narrative style. I'm not just talking about narrative in an epistemological sense, but also in an ontological sense. And here I'm very deeply influenced by Paul Ricoeur's work on time and narratives and many other pieces of work associated with that. And I want to talk about the time and narratives for Paul Ricoeur. It is basically about time. Human agency is about time and how you perceive it. And I call it as plasticity of time. And so he moves away from time in a chronological sense of past, present, and future, and he collapses them. And he calls them as three memesis. That means your future aspirations are conditioned and shaped by your memories and as well as your experiences in the present. And so then he plays around with that portion and is really exciting as to how the past, present, and future are plastic. You can play around with that. So for me, the notion of temporality in this is a kind of a swath of time. Then clearly narratives are about relationality. And some of the discussions you had before about conversations and how things emerge in and through the conversations, if you want to read some more of that, I think Taylor and Van Ivory's book on the emergent organization would be rather useful place to start. But I want to focus on intertextuality. And a fair close argument of intertextuality is that, when you speak, and if you come from Judith Butler as well, it is actually the context from which you're speaking from. The symbols and language which are in currency is what allows you to speak actually, and then deviate from that. So this notion of intertextuality is kind of embedded and embodied agency that I was talking about. And for this talk, I said I just wanted to add emotionality because I've been reading on emotionalities. And of course, storytelling and narratives is full of the pathos, the passion and the emotions, and which is in the logos. And that is, if you look at the neurocoupling, if I tell you a story and I can actually transmit my emotions to you. So I'm more interested about the excitement about the future, for instance, and how you can become optimistic. So those are the three things from narrative which I'll take away for the moment. Now I want to come to design and spend a few minutes. Henrik, you'll have to stop me in case I go beyond 15 minutes, but I'll just come to my last few slides very quickly now.
It's fine. You're well in your time.
So I start with Herbert Simon's parable of the watches, the two watchmakers, Tempus and Hora, which anyone who's read the book on Sciences of the Artificial, which Henrik was showing, not to go into too many details, but both of them had, were creating these watches from scratch, from handcrafted watches. And then there would be a knock on the door and they would get distracted. And when they got distracted, they had to start again. So that's the kind of a mystery as to why they had to do that. Most people, so what happened, one of them, I think it's Hora, what he does is he's smart enough to create sub-assemblies. And he creates sub-assemblies so that every time there's a knock, he has to only go back to the sub-assembly is not finished. So that is where the notion of near decomposability comes in. And that's where the notion of modularity and platforms and Carlos Baldwin and all the kind of beautiful stuff in the areas of platforms. But what really intrigued me about this whole thing was, why does this person have to go back to scratch? And that led me, it was because, of course, the person is unable to take from your short-term memory to long-term memory. So a knock on the door could have been the opportunity, but it's distracting this person. So this notion of temporality is this event time. In the case for Herbert Simon, it was that, okay, the knock on the door is creating a distraction. And so he talks about near decomposability. And therefore he gets modularity. But what if there is a way of creating a memory, a generative memory, which you can remember even despite the knock on the door? that you can, when you come back, you don't have to reconstruct. And that led us to write a paper called Incomplete by Design and Designing for Incompleteness, which is actually building upon Simon's work, in which surrogate memories come into play. But in any case, the notion of temporality which comes in, which I'd like to bring in the neo-design approach, is one of kairos, not of chronos. The kairos is when in the opportune moment, not when the clock is right. And so these are event times that we are interested in. Let me go to the next one, relationality. And there, in the neo-design, rather than only a watchmaker, there are multiple people, as Saras was talking about, who are interacting with each other and the objects thereof. And the term intra-actions comes from Karen Barard's work, in which the people, when they interact, their identities shift and the functionality of the materials also changes. So this is a much more of a process metaphysics rather than interactions in which everything remains as it is. So the relationality is that you're relating with and you're creating in the and you're constituting in the moment. And finally, the notion of emotionality is that there's a lot of writing that the sources of that the emotions are sources of intuition and creativity. So that it's a part, it kind of assists rationality. So these are the two things that I'm talking about. One is narratives and neo-design. And what I think the two complement each other in the quest of performativity. And that is that narratives, because of their plasticity, because of the connection in time, provides a generative memory, an intertemporal connective tissue for actors to deal with the problems of inattention that arises with classical views on design. And design, as substance and process, that is noun and verb, serves as a catalyst to induce kairotic moments within ongoing processes. So the two of them are rather important, I think, coming together. So my final slide for today before I stop is there's some kind of representation I was trying to do. The talk actually was far more complicated with illocutionary, perlocutionary, and all that kind of stuff, but that is important actually once you get into this whole thing. But for me, the first part of it is that, you got this relationality, temporality, and emotionality, in which you got inter and intra actions and temporality. And then the emotionality is a forecaring, that is about the future. You are interested about the future. You are excited about this. And when you try to actually do things, of course, you experiment and you transform, but you find that it will not be the way you set it into motion. That's what it is. And so you have to, there will be power shifts as these kind of positions will shift, and you have to repair what you had promised. And so you see these kind of pivots going on and how you have to look at the past and the future at the same time. So with that, I'm going to say, why should we care with performativity? I think, it opens up a new way of thinking and asking different kinds of questions. Rather than accuracy of predictions, we may start looking at issues such as prospection, consensual validation involving legitimacy and credibility. Rather than information updating and diffusion, we conceptualize the process as one driven by interpretive flexibility and translation. We can see clearly entrepreneurship not as a destination, but as an ongoing journey with ups and downs in inter and intra-active temporal processes. Well, these are the sources I built upon, and they build upon many, of course, the intellectual base. So if anyone is interested in any of these things, please feel free to look at them or ask me about it. I close with a kind of imagery which was kind of rather startlingly similar to what Saras closed with. She'd got two people, actually. It's apparently those are the two inner worlds conversing. Mine is one of Janus. And the Janus is both the ending and the beginning, So we're always in the middle of things. And of course, now if I combine that with what Saras was saying, it's both got temporality and relationality inside it. Well, thank you so much, folks. I'm looking forward to any conversations that this might provoke.
That's super interesting, and we had some people asking in the chat for some of the references, and Joel generously sharing them in the chat as well. But my plan is I'll send an email to each of the presenters asking for just a list of works that you are building on and citing when you talk, so I can share it with everyone who's interested. So all of you who sign up on that Google form I shared at the beginning, I can send you a list of all these citations later. So, questions? None in the chat so far that I can see.
Oh, I had one.
Go ahead.
But that was also maybe to you about the prototyping, whether first I had if it's experimentation or transformation, or when it's experimentation or transformation in relation to what Garud said.
So you asking me a question now?
Yeah.
That wasn't very courteous of you. Well, I mean, to perhaps latch on to what I think Raghu was talking about, I think whether or not an artifact is, you know, a particular kind of artifact, let's say a prototype or a piece of software, is experimentally or transformationally used, is largely about the intention you have and the context in which you bring it up. So I think it's that idea of an artifact is very, very flexible, and any particular thing, a very kind of precise, you know, physical thing that is very kind of stable, you know, a diamond, you know, can be used transformationally as well, as long as you embed it in a context and a conversation that frames it as such. So that's probably how I would respond to that question in a very general sense. But now let's talk about Raghu's presentation.
Well, you know, from my point of view, your experimentation leads to transformation. They are integrally linked. That's how I read Henrik's work, although it initially starts with the distinction between them.
No, but I would agree. I mean, the way I set them up is, of course, as very kind of abstract conceptual types that are useful to just think about things. But in any particular situation, it's all gonna bleed into one another and be much more complex than any of those types can ever articulate.
But one of the things in Raghu's idea of performativity, right? There is this notion of intervention, Raghu, right? So transformation, I would argue, is a little bit more interventional. It intervenes in reality in some ways, right, to change it. Experimentation does kind of raise this idea of a little bit more hands-off, right? You're trying to learn. So they are connected, but I think there is value in also thinking of them as separate processes. So because transformation, I would think, is really performative, more so than experimentation. Just a useful way of categorizing things, especially if we are going to study them empirically.
Yes, because it's a meta-theoretical situation, it's the kind of lens you bring to bear. And when it comes to entrepreneurship and social experimentation, in the very doing of things and the very saying of things, you actually change the phenomenon. So I come from the Hawthorne experiments, in which, you know, they went and tried to do the experiments, and in the very doing of it, you know, they actually changed the environments around them. Anyway, so that's from a performative point of view. All these, you know, Black-Scholes model and the markets and whether they exist or not exist. I think the point is that when you actually propose a net present value or a Black-Scholes or something else, actually you create the markets in the very proposal of it. So this is Michel Calon's famous talk, you know, that without economists, there's no economy. I mean, of course, he's being very provocative about it. Anyway, so it's a way of thinking about it. When we go and say that we actually want to create an experiment about markets, then we actually create the markets.
So Dimo, you had a reflection on researching communication.
I mean, it just follows up on the idea of entrepreneurship as an ongoing process of performativity. And if we try to apply a design science lens, is there a sense in which we're trying to think about how we can make entrepreneurs better communicators? And is there a room for blending in with communication science or departments of communication with universities, which obviously they sit in completely different areas. They're outside of the business school, but that's what communication does. They study, you know, how do we use words to do things? To build up on your, Raghu, on your reference to Austin at the beginning.
I think it's so the term communication is kind of a little problematic for me. It's as if I'm trying to communicate from one to the other, which was the discussion we had earlier. But if we take a broader meaning of the term communication and the rhetorics, and if you take a broader perspective called discourse, from which these things happen, I think that they play a very central role in entrepreneurship studies, in terms of what people say, how they pitch their ideas, at what levels, what kind of temporal frames they bring into their pitches and their talk. How do they relate to other people's temporal agencies? Do they interrelate or not? Do they entrain? Do they detrain? So it raises a whole host of issues. The one which is of real interest to me is the intertemporal paradoxes which happen. So if you pitch the idea with a lot of promises up front, and then you can't deliver, then what happens is that you start losing legitimacy later on. And so how do you pitch the ideas in such a manner that, knowing fully well from a performative point of view that you're not going to be fulfilling what you, these are just speculative bets, as they're called, to start the journey going. And then when you start the journey, then you're going to encounter situations where the very things that you promised or at least projected will not happen. And so if you're not careful, then you start escalating your commitments rather than changing and pivoting. So how do you present in such a manner that when you meet the future, you can kind of change your story, in an honest manner. So these are kind of conundrums which are, I think, interesting, Dimo, to be addressed. And then the question is, the rhetorics and from a Judith Butler's point of view, how do you deviate from the existing discourse? Because the moment you do so, then you're not considered to be legitimate. You'll start losing cognitive and moral legitimacy. So that has led to a whole set of issues called optimal distinctiveness and all that in cultural entrepreneurship, which is kind of being pushed by Mike Lounsbury and other people around. So your questions are very well taken. I think that they are central, in my opinion.
I think picking up on that, and another question in the chat there about artifacts and narratives. I think just like one might look at say mechanical engineers and how they work with material physical prototypes as part of developing some sort of product, or internet-based startup working with some sort of online A/B test with landing pages or online advertising to test value propositions, etc. Drawing on different disciplinary knowledge to optimize those things and develop design principles for how to do that effectively. You could, of course, do similar things for the narrative type of artifact, if you will. And this, I think, is what Saras, what you're doing with this Ask project. You're basically developing design principles for how to structure conversations in various ways, framing your asks not as pitches, etc., in order to get something going that is generative as opposed to just getting a yes or no, etc. So I think, I'm not sure if you draw specifically on communication theory, but it is in that vein, I would say. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It is just that in communication theory, there are very few studies actually of conversations. That's what I found, right? Communication theory seems to be much more about kind of broadcasting. And there is also studies of narratives, which is in writing, right? The actual study of conversation is not, I was actually quite disappointed in my review that people were not really studying conversations. And the only people who have anything interesting to say about it are like playwrights, right? Because they actually have to write and then perform conversations. So theater has a little bit more. So I was actually not that persuaded by all the stuff that's going on in communication science, because I think they have a different focus of interest in some ways. So the study of conversations is fascinating, and that's what I'm trying to do. I literally built like an axiomatic theory of entrepreneurial communication. That's what I've ended up doing in the book. So I'll send the chapters out. Literally all the like a taxonomy of different ways you can frame exactly the same very simple question, and how in each case it cues in different things and the different possible responses and what you can learn from it. So it's really, really micro, the stuff that I've done. So I can send that out if people are interested. But absolutely. So in that case, the smallest unit of communication literally becomes an artifact. So you can taxonomize it, you can axiomatize it, you can actually really look at it in very different ways. So it's kind of really micro, not at all meta, what I have done.
Well, let me address Sue Cohen's question about artifacts and narratives in a very, it has been already addressed by Henrik and Saras already. But I want to actually draw your attention to what happened in the case of the Post-it notes, which all of you know the story about. This gentleman called Spence Silver, he's doing an experiment, and he goes out of the way to do something which he has not done before. He purposely, goes and mixes the mixture because he has an intuition, and he creates a glue that does not glue. And he's looking for a glue that glues, of course, and he finds something which does not glue. So all of us would say, this is a mistake, and we would throw it off, but not Spence Silver. He says, he looks under at the material under the microscope and says, that's interesting, but he doesn't know what to call it. So he doesn't give it language. What he does is he takes it around and he leaves it with other people to play around with it. And that's how the story starts building up. The narrative around this is that people start using it on the bulletin board. They use it for this, they use it for that. Eventually it becomes Post-it notes. That's after 12 years. So when doing is saying is that, sometimes in fact, the moment you bring in language to label something and categorize something, you start limiting it. You don't look at it, you don't identify its acceptive value, because if the artifact is in the context, then the people in the context are going to give the labels to it. And when they give the labels, you start finding new functionalities for it. Anyway, so these are two interrelated. The saying is doing and doing is saying are interrelated.
They may be interrelated, but they really are separate, right? I mean, I don't think people could sit in a room and stare at the Post-its and come up with the ideas, right? By actually using it, playing with it, sticking it on stuff and doing stuff. So I think they're related, but I'm saying I don't want to give up the idea that artifacts are actually doing some work that can't be done by words, right? So I am deeply appreciative of the narrative view of the world, but I would want to keep the purposes of the narratives and the artifacts and the particular work they do. They don't do the same work. We need both of them, right?
But Saras, that's my whole presentation, which you're saying. I'm saying the same thing. So thank you for summarizing it. But I want to talk about Dimo's question. What do we teach in comparison to what engineers and architects are taught? And I think, what for a long time we have been teaching is, make business plans to our, I'm just giving you an example. I don't know who teaches business plans nowadays, but we do teach business plans, and that is, it's not the plan that matters, it is planning that matters. Like Carl White builds upon Kobayashi, and he says any map will do. So, but the problem is if you draw a map, which is rather detailed, and then you get locked into the map, and that's problematic. So we ought to be able to teach people that, look, this is if you come from a performative point of view, which is what I'm trying to present today, then these are fictions about the future. And where I'm going with this, we have to be really careful about getting caught up in the fictions. Otherwise, we might get a Theranos kind of situation in which we keep on pursuing a course of action, which is, in fact, at some point becomes rather immoral as well. Anyway, I'm kind of quickly going through the comments finally out here.
May I add to that, Raghu? Because I actually do a performative exercise in class on the asking. literally create scenarios and have the students create like a 3-minute playlet. So they choose the scenario, they literally write the script, they create the characters, they have to create the setting, and they perform it in front of the class, or they create a video. And then the class discusses it. And it's amazing how the discussion is completely different than if the student just stood there and pitched. Because people would start talking about things like body language. They would say, why did you like lean back when you asked that question? And you went on this. Why didn't you hear what that other woman in the, so they create these random characters, right? That woman was saying something. Why didn't you pay any attention? You know, so that I think that is one thing we can bring. I think we should bring in theater into class. So in terms of what we teach, apart from engineering, and I think theater is a very useful way to talk about all of these things and get students more self-aware of what they are doing in conversation. So at least one example I have of some additional thing that is purely performative that you can bring in that they definitely do not do in architecture and in engineering, I don't think.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but Pascal has patiently been raising his hand. So before we take a break, I'll just ask Pascal to if it was something you want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. It's just a remark. We have the impression that we take a lot of notions from external world, language or performativity. And what I learned, I guess, from Sarah and the Raghu is finally that as soon as we use these notions in the field of design, suddenly they are enriched and changed. Because for instance, if we use performativity in design, the notion of what is done exactly is a question. You not only have an act that is indisputably here, but you suggest, you stimulate, you might let people imagining things. So I have the impression that with design, we can not only use the external notion like language, communication, performativity, but we can also enrich those same notions. And probably there is something specific in the conversation in design situation. And probably the conversation in design situation might be different from conversation in decision-making or classical cultural conversation, whatever. And I think the impression that in the discussion we have right now is that all these notions are useful for us, but they can be also enriched by the design perspective.
It's a nice note to end this session on. We can not only borrow concepts, we can improve them and perhaps ship them back again and help those poor literary theorists going forward as well. So let's take a break for 10 minutes and restart again at 5:40. Okay, but this was awesome. Thank you very much.